Hi, Professor Todashini here, back for lectures on evolution and microbial life. So in this lecture series, we're going to look at possible origins of life on Earth and then look at microbial diversity. So the first part, we're just going to go back and review a little bit about the history of life on Earth, the history of Earth. So let's just jump right into the timeline. This timeline puts the origin of Earth around 4.5 billion years ago. Very, very long time. And the earliest fossil records estimate the very first prokaryotic cell to be about 4.2 to 3.8 billion years old. So when that first cell appeared, photosynthesis came a bit later, 3.7 billion years ago. And then those prokaryotes were alone on the planet for about 3 billion years. There was only prokaryotic life found on the planet. And then we see here about 1.5 billion years ago, eukaryotes showed up. And remember, eukaryotes are cells that have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. The prokaryotes are cells that are more simple and they lack a nucleus. So all bacteria are prokaryotes, and all prokaryotes are a form of bacteria. So that is a long time that those bacteria were present on the planet and basically changing the environment and making it more hospitable for organisms like humans that showed up much, much later. So we see the origin of prokaryotic life. 3 billion years later, eukaryotes showed up. Those gave rise to organisms with cells like ours. We see plants, multicellularity, and then vertebrates, land animals, and here we are, hominids, about 6 million years ago. So a totally different time scale. So what happened to the planet in this time and life? Well, we go back to the very, very beginning. Life on the planet, when it began, the planet was very, very inhospitable, or at least we would consider it today. There was a lot of noxious gas, a lot of raining down of fire, electrical storms, mostly inorganic compounds and gases in the environment, very, very hot. So life began somehow in this early environment, and then the bacteria that were there for those 3 billion years changed the planet and into what we know today, a very hospitable, nice place to be most of the time. So what was the likely progression of development of life? And we do need to note that nobody knows exactly how the first living cell came to be. We do know based on molecules today what the progression likely would have been. So we have all these inorganic compounds that were present in the atmosphere, and then they would have had to, in that atmosphere, well as electricity and energy, come together to form more complex compounds or organic compounds. So very, very simple organic compounds. And we know that organic compounds are made out of monomers, and those monomers could have joined together to form more complex organic compounds, including things like RNA and DNA. And the lipids that were present likely self-assembled in an aqueous environment to these little droplets. Somehow, wonder of wonders, DNA and other proteins, RNA, got enclosed in those droplets and began to replicate. And that is not something that is to be taken lightly. It was an incredible thing that happened, and we still don't know how to explain exactly why or how it came about. But that must have been the first cell, because we know that all cells come from other cells. So the first cell had to have come from a very simple beginnings. And this is not quite a prokaryote. This is called a protocell, or a precursor to a prokaryote. Evidence that supports the idea that molecules can become more complex with just adding energy is a famous experiment done, Miller and Urey experiment, where these guys took a lot of inorganic compounds and they tried to recreate the early Earth's atmosphere by removing all oxygen, adding some electricity, and kind of zapping those compounds in this primordial soup is what it's referred to as. And there was more complex molecules that were created. So giving support to that process could have happened that way. Oops. There's still some debate as to what was actually in the early atmosphere, but we do see that polymerization happening, which would be something that would have had to occur no matter how this process occurred. So those macromolecules, proteins, carbs, and lipids, that's what we're made out of today. So if those were present, then the building blocks for life were present. There's also some evidence that clay surfaces in the ground could have helped to kind of make an anchor for some molecules, and then other molecules could have come along and stuck to them. So just some ideas of how that polymerization could have happened. And here is showing base pairing in nucleic acids. So this is would be RNA today because it has the uracil and the A, and how those nucleic acid macromolecules could have formed. But again, how did that become self-replicating and so tightly controlled where the cells can divide in the way they can today is still pretty mind-boggling and amazing. Life began in these very humble beginnings. And those are the protocells, the very, very earliest cells that were formed that eventually gave rise to prokaryotes. So here, this Hadean eon, this period before very, very early Earth, the very first Earth's atmosphere was not very nice place, hot, fiery, gaseous place. But bacteria living there, they changed the atmosphere. So one of the first things that we see on this timeline that happens after the prokaryote is the origin of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis added a very important compound to the environment, and it began to increase the amount of oxygen. It took a while, but oxygen began to accumulate. And with that, aerobic bacteria or prokaryotes began to utilize that oxygen, and the relationship between photosynthesis and respiration sort of took hold, and the aerobic bacteria and photosynthetic bacteria, through the endosymbiotic theory, began to a larger cell ingested those and began the formation of eukaryotes, which we'll look at in a bit. So this graph shows what the composition of the atmosphere was likely like in that very early time period, lots and lots of carbon dioxide, and then photosynthesis began to take advantage of that carbon dioxide, so CO2 levels began to drop, and then O2 levels began to go up. So photosynthesizers removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and added oxygen to the atmosphere. And that gave rise to aerobic bacteria. And aerobic bacteria could make ATP much more efficiently. And with lots of energy being made by an organism, it eventually gave way to the appearance of multicellular organisms. If you've got enough energy, then you can start getting more complex with your excess energy. If you just barely have enough to survive, you're not going to be able to grow very, very large. All right, so that kind of wraps up our first run through the timeline of Earth. We'll do our clicker question and wrap up this lecture. Why was the Miller experiment important? What did it show? I'll let you read through the choices. Give you a minute. So the answer is D, and it showed that that very first step that would have had to happen from inorganic compounds, that they could have begun to assemble into larger compounds. All right, so the mastering concept here, an idea to leave you with, is why is RNA likely to have been pivotal in life's beginnings? So RNA was likely the first genetic compound found on the planet, not DNA, and that's supported because RNA is found in many, many forms. We learned a little bit in protein synthesis and gene expression last semester that RNA can turn genes on and off, RNA can splice genes, RNA can be involved in building proteins. So RNA is very versatile. So it was likely the first compound that was found in living cells, and then DNA most likely was a stable storage compound that was kind of a spin-off from RNA to store an organism's genetic code. So we'll wrap up this lecture, and I'll see you for the next one.